Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session. Super excited to have all of you here today. If you don't know already, this is going to be a really awesome session from Chinat, who is an MLH Fellow as well as an MLH Top 50 member. He's going to be talking you through some of the frameworks you can use to really level up your hackathon projects. I'm super excited for this session. So without further ado, I am going to hand it on over to him. Hello.
Hello. Nice to meet you all. So today I'm going to share with you the EDUCE framework. The first thing that I want to make sure that you guys think about is, why are you here? What brings you to a hackathon, right? And so I wanted you guys to take kind of 30 seconds to think a little bit about, why do you even go to hackathons in the first place? And if you have your answer, feel free to either drop it in the chat or scan the QR code and fill out the form. That would be very much appreciated. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so different people might have different reasons why they want to go to hackathons. Some people perhaps want to go to hackathons to win. Other people might think about, like, they want to attend a hackathon to learn how to code. Or there might be some other people who might just want to find a meaningful project to work on. Based on your expectation, the way that you might want to try and approach hackathons might be different. And so today, I want to walk you through the process which I use to find my personal meaningful projects during hackathons, which is the EDUCE framework. And so a little bit more about myself. As you can see here, this is my DevPost profile. I've had the chance to attend a lot of hackathons over the past year. I made it a personal goal of mine to try and attend at least one hackathon a month. And that has resulted in me being not only involved as an MLH Fellow, but also being an MLH Top 50. And this right here is, in fact, a picture of a recent hackathon that I had. I want to share with you these experiences because I think that it is so important for us to leverage our hackathons as launch pads in order for us to find and forge our future careers. In fact, I would attribute a lot of my experiences in these hackathons to helping me find an internship at Microsoft over this past summer. And so what is this EDUCE framework am I talking about in the first place? Well, mainly it is broken into 5 steps. First is edge analysis. The second one is then to try to discover the problem. The third step is to then understand the problem. The fourth one is hopefully creating a solution and a story around the problem before finally evaluating how effective your solution is in the first place. And while we like to think that it ends up linearly like this, reality is that they often perhaps go in different directions, or you might end up skipping steps, or you might even go all over the place. But for the sake of today, I'd like to present it to you in a linear format, in this tidy and package format, but with a caveat that in a real hackathon, things might completely go off the rails, but that's completely okay and understandable. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these stages. With edge analysis, first of all, you want to try and figure out how can you potentially define a personal and meaningful problem that pertains to you. I think that a lot of people often go into a hackathon and they try to jump onto whatever solution that they think is cool, or like a project that other people talk about, but they don't really figure out why are they even working on this project in the first place, and how do they personally identify with the problem. Secondly, you want to kind of empathize with the problem through a cone of understanding. Once you do that, then you can then brainstorm and evaluate potential solutions before finally building a prototype and based on criteria that is based on your story. And then finally, the last stage is to then reflect and figure out what are the next best steps for you when you want to approach, whether it be this project or future hackathons. And so today I would like to kind of share with you and contextualize everything with like a kind of case study. This is one of the highlight hackathons that I've had called Grand Connect, where we essentially built an app that would help you to figure out conversation starters with your grandparents. Essentially, you would go to this web app and you would share a little bit of information about your grandparents, and periodically, we would then send you text messages about potential conversational openers that you can then have with your grandparents in order to bridge that generational divide. And so I'll be using this project here as a kind of case study because we actually ended up performing very well in this hackathon, winning 4 of the prizes, including the overall second place, 1 of the track prizes, and 2 of the sponsored prize as well. And so kind of diving into that EDUCE framework now in terms of more detail, the reality is that often it's important to not only have these theoretical frameworks in mind, but also figure out how can you tie that to concrete and specific activities that you can actually do. So with edge analysis, for example, there are 4 things that you want to understand. Number 1 is, what are the past projects that you've actually done? And how are they related to perhaps the skills that you know? Right? You want to make sure that you tie them together. And so for me, for example, having worked on like Grand Connect, some of the skills that I might have is like web development, using Twilio for like text messaging. What are the skills that I'm learning? For example, I'm learning how to actually use generative AI a little bit better and call some of the latest APIs that OpenAI kind of released. And what are the skills that I want to practice is then taking potentially a combination of the skills that you know, the skills that you're learning, or completely new skills. And you want to kind of do this with your entire team because it kind of helps to provide that grounding and constraints of what kind of solution you guys will end up building. And so what you would end up with is what I would call the lay of the land matrix. In fact, this is from actually one of the hackathons that we had, where essentially each column here is one of those 4 kind of categories that I mentioned to you earlier, whereas each of these red sticky notes here are the 4 team members. And so by looking at this rapidly, you can immediately understand what are the kind of skills that the team has, what kind of skills that the team is interested in practicing. So from a technical perspective, at least, we would then be able to understand what are the capabilities and the scope of the projects that we can potentially tackle. And now once you've done that kind of edge analysis and figured out, okay, what is our competitive advantage? What is our competitive edge? Then you can move on to the second stage, which is to discover the problem. And with discovering the problem, I like to think about it as kind of like a 2-stage process that's heavily linked to understanding the problem as well. And where, first of all, you want to kind of like brainstorm different problems that you guys might potentially personally empathize with, and do a kind of like a general need finding on yourself in order to find a problem that you're personally attached to, before then kind of narrowing it down and picking one problem that you want to solve, and then going through the same process later on with understanding in terms of expanding the number of potential solutions that you might want to explore before gradually narrowing down into one solution that you guys actually want to build out an MVP for. And so as you can see here, one of the first things that you want to do when exploring and discovering the problems is kind of just brainstorming what potentially problems that you guys might have. And so as students, our lives are generally categorized into 4 categories, which includes work, relationship, health, and play. And so usually when I go to hackathons, I like to kind of brainstorm with my team about like what are the different personal problems and specific anecdotes that we have regarding these 4 different categories. So under work, for example, there might be academics or career. Relationship includes both professional and personal relationships. Health includes both physical health as well as mental health. And play includes both potentially traveling as well as finding fun hobbies. The thing is, and the trick here is to make sure that when you're finding some of these problems, that you want to make sure that you identify personal anecdotes to it. So rather than saying that, oh, I feel like I don't have enough time to, do my homework, which can be an abstraction of the fact that you don't have enough time to go around the day. Instead, you want to think about a more specific instance. For example, oh, I feel like I didn't have enough time to finish my assignment for my chemistry class last night. and that resulted me in submitting it late for 30 minutes, which resulted in a potential deduction of the grade in a certain percentage. And so by tying it to kind of specific problems, not only are you setting up yourself for success when you want to present your solution later down the line, but more importantly, it is also a bonding activity where you're creating a psychological safe space within your team members and kind of building that trust and bonding that would set you up for success later down the line when you're actually trying to build a solution together. And so once you kind of generated all these ideas, you might want to kind of recategorize them, right? There are multiple problems that might fit into multiple categories. So just going back to the example that I shared earlier with work, relationship, health, and play, you can think about the time management issue as not only as being something that is related to your academics, but also related to your mental health. Or for example, specifically when I was working on Grand Connect project, our problem was focused on understanding how grandparents' relationships worked with their grandchildren, right? I shared a personal anecdote where I unfortunately lost one of my grandpas, and how that has had an impact on me on not only a relationship level, but also on a mental health level as well. And I was able to kind of connect similarly with some of the other dots that some of my other teammates were sharing regarding their personal experiences too. And so once you kind of lay out all those kind of anecdotes and stories out there, the next step of the process is that you want to kind of pick a problem that you're actually interested in solving. And usually you want to kind of spend 5 to 10 minutes thinking about this. You want to make sure that you narrow it down based on specific constraints, like what exactly are the tracks in the hackathon, going back to the edge analysis map and the lay of the land matrix that you created earlier. What are the specific skills and technical capabilities that the team is, or just generally which idea actually stands out to the team, what actually pulls at their heartstrings and make them excited. When you think about it from a problem-oriented approach rather than a solution-based approach, you often identify and find more meaningful problems to solve that would set you up for more success in the hackathon and really help you identify what are those meaningful and impactful projects that you actually want to work on. Once you've identified the problem that you want to solve, for my example here, that was with Grand Connect, the problem specifically was to figure out how can I connect better with my grandparents and how can we bridge that generational divide. Then you go through what we share is the cone of understanding. Now, before I continue on with the cone of understanding, though, I want to make sure that I pause right here to give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions or any comments that you guys might have about the framework so far in terms of developing an edge analysis of your personal team, as well as discovering a problem that is really personal to you. Cool. So without further ado, let's continue on with explaining a little bit more about this third stage of the process, which is doing the cone of understanding. The cone of understanding involves kind of understanding it on 3 different levels. Why does this problem matter to you as an individual? Why does this problem matter to the people immediately around you? And why does this problem matter to the wider society as a whole? And so when you think about the first level, why does this problem specifically matters to you? There are 2 activities associated with it, which is root cause analysis and stakeholders analysis. The first thing that you want to do is understanding what is the root cause, which is to start off with asking about multiple whys. I see that there's a question that came up right now. I'm going to explain the root cause analysis and then I'll get to it after that. So with the 5 whys, you want to first of all think about what is a problem that you might have at hand and ask yourself on each level why that problem is the case. And so, for example, in this example right here, the problem might be, hey, I ran through a red light. And you might want to ask yourself, well, why did I run through a red light? Maybe that is because you were late for work. But why are you late for work? Perhaps that is because you actually woke up late accidentally. But why is that the case? Perhaps the alarm didn't work. But why? Perhaps it was because the battery was exhausted. And why is that? Oh, I forgot to check it, right? And so the fact that you ran through the red light, the root cause of that is might be you forgot to check the alarm on your battery. Now, obviously, you're not trying to actually come up with the ending results that the fact, coming to the realization that because you forgot to check your battery, then you ran through a red light. The reality is that by doing this exercise, hopefully you're trying to gain new insights into the problem that you might have. And so specifically with my project previously with Grand Connect, what we did was I asked myself, why did I not end up why haven't I gotten a chance to talk much to my grandparents, right? And the answer that I came up with was that I don't really know what to talk about. And so when I asked myself, why do I think that I don't really know what to talk about? Then I realized that I really don't know much about my grandparents on certain levels. And when you ask yourself why, you might think that you might not know your grandparents on certain levels. Well, the answer for that is because perhaps I never asked. And why is that the case? Well, it's perhaps because I'm busy, right? And so kind of doing this root cause analysis kind of helped me realize that perhaps the reason why that I don't talk as much as I want to with my grandparents isn't necessarily because I don't know what to talk to them, but instead it's because I'm busy and I, can't simply kind of afford the time to kind of build on top of that relationship. So yeah, here we have a question in a hackathon. How do we implement these with people you've never met? So good question, Lounge Cat. I think that for me, at least when I come into the conversation, I like to share with people that, hey, I have these activities and exercises that I think that would be great for us to do together in order for us to figure out whether or not which problem we want to work on together. I think that usually I often start out with the edge analysis, and I do it with people who I've never met. I'll be like, hey, I know that it's fun. We're working on this cool hackathon together. Let's figure out what we want to work on. I have this cool activity that we can do that I think that would help us kind of guide us towards understanding each other better, as well as understanding what the problem that we might want to solve. Now, I understand that this might feel uncomfortable, feel a little bit awkward because you're putting yourself out there, but trust me that it would pay off way further in the long run. And if you need any convincing of them, you can also feel free to share with them this stream or this video at the end of the stream right here. And hopefully that would provide them with the credibility that is needed to hopefully be able to follow through with these activities. But again, these are suggestions that you can share with the group. Different people might have different approaches towards hackathons. So this is something that is strongly recommended, but not something that people might end up actually sticking through. But great question. Thank you for asking that. Cool. So moving forward with the next question, which is next step, which is stakeholders analysis. The question that you want to ask here is that once you've kind of developed the personal insight on terms of why is this problem specifically interesting to me, and kind of trying to extract and mine all that information, the next thing that you want to think about, okay, who pertains to this specifically problem, right? Who's involved? So for example, if you're thinking about building an academic app, perhaps like like a course website, then you have the faculty, the students, the admin, the parents. For my specific example that I shared with you earlier with Grand Connect, some of the people, our stakeholders, includes the grandchildren, perhaps the parents, the grandparents, the nursery homes, as well as potentially the way that they communicate. And so just thinking through all these different stakeholders allows you to kind of understand later down the line in terms of like, how do I understand this problem a little bit more? What specific people do I want to actually go after and ask questions from? And so this activity here, by understanding who else, is related to the problem, kind of leads us to the second level of the cone of understanding, which is understanding how do the people around you care about this problem. And this includes doing exercises like user interview as well as observations. And so when you're thinking about doing interviews or questions, usually when I go to hackathons, I end up picking a problem that there is a student population students can potentially identify with, because we know that there is a student population that is constantly available to us in terms of other hackers around us. And so I would immediately try and think about what are some of the assumptions that I want to kind of understand, what are some of the questions that would help me kind of enlighten some of these assumptions, and kind of figure out how can I then interview these other peers or people around me to kind of get a better understanding of the problem. So specifically in the case of Grant Connect, we wanted to understand a little bit more about how other people have their relationship with their grandparents, right? What are the significance of their grandparents to them? And other than the factor of time, were there other potential barriers that were holding people back from maintaining that kind of strong relationship? And so we actually went around at like 10 p.m., going around different other tables and potentially just asking people, be like, hey, do you have like 5 minutes to spare? I want to ask you a couple questions that are related to my project. We're sure trying to explore this problem space a little bit more before we end up building a solution. Do you mind sparing 5 minutes, right? And some people might end up saying no, but there are definitely people who would also end up saying yes too. And so far, I've always been able to find someone to interview at every single hackathon. And by kind of doing these interviews, what we were able to realize was that in addition to the barrier of time, there were additional barriers that other people might face. For example, one of the people that we interviewed ended up sharing that, her grandparents, because of their old age, are suffering from dementia as well as other neural cognitive kind of setbacks that kind of hold back some of the ways that they potentially engage in conversations. Or another student kind of shared how he is actually an immigration family and his grandparents are, back in the original country where they are from. And as a result of that, there's a kind of a language barrier in terms of the way that they communicate. And so by kind of going around and understanding a little bit more about the people around us, we can then understand and enlighten us about potentially what are some of the additional problems that people are facing when they're trying to address these kind of issues about, for example, connections with their grandparents. And so once you kind of gain that better understanding, one thing to note here is that in addition to actually interviewing the students around you, another thing that I like to do is to rapidly turn the questions into a Google form and like send them to all my friends or family or any additional stakeholders that I might want to ask or interview. For example, if we want to know what our parents' perspectives on a certain topic or a certain matter, for example, if I want to know like, hey, Mom, do you actually think that I'm having a close enough relationship with my grandpa? I can quickly text my mom or call her as well. And that kind of allows me to kind of access a little bit more about the additional stakeholders that we might have identified earlier. And so in addition to in-person observations and interviews, it might be also helpful to consider creating like a quick Google form or quick text messages to your friends to kind of confirm and understand a lot of these kind of assumptions and explore the problem space a little bit more. And that leads us to the third level of the cone of understanding, which is to conduct your secondary research. And when you're conducting your secondary research, you're thinking about, looking wide out there, learning a little bit more about the problem space. So for example, with Grand Connect, when I was understanding the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren and looking at their generational divide, I quickly just looked up on Google Scholar, what are the latest sociology researches on like intergenerational relationships, right? And you want to potentially read the abstract and the summary, because after all, this is a rapid hackathon and we're not trying to do like rigorous research here, but it might be helpful for us to kind of gain these kind of general insights. In addition to reading actually academic papers, you can also read articles, blog posts, or just look at what are some of the other potential solutions that exist out there. For example, with Grant Connect, when we were building out our solution, we kind of looked at other existing platforms that kind of help to connect their grandparents and grandchildren. And there were quite a few that were like video conferencing software that were easy to use for your grandparents that you can just dial into to kind of have a chat with your folks back home. And so kind of having that secondary research and that understanding helps us to understand a little bit more about the problem space, as well as what are some of the existing solutions that exist out there. Once we do all of that research and kind of collect all that information, remember going back to the earlier double diamond diagram, we kind of think about a little bit more about the problem space. And we're trying to kind of synthesize and get all of that information and narrow it down into a specific problem that we actually want to solve. And so before I continue on to talking a little bit about synthesis and analysis, I'm going to quickly pause here to see if there's any questions about like the cone of understanding and the way that we should go about approaching potentially understanding some of the problems that we're trying to address. What is the form link shared earlier good for? Thanks, regards. Yeah, so the form link shared earlier was just for you to kind of share a little bit about why you actually go to hackathons, as well as a way for us to know kind of who's here today. I'd love to know who's here. And so, yeah, the form link was shared earlier. You guys can fill it out. It'll be great. Launchcat asked, in this research phase, how do you divvy up responsibility to make use of time available? Great question. So I think that generally it depends on who's coming in and what they are looking for, right? Usually an activity that I like to do with whether it be research or like brainstorming in the first place is a framework called Think, Pair, Share. And so you would spend you would set a 1-minute timer or 2-minute timer just thinking about the problem, or in this case, maybe doing the research and doing the Googling, right? And then once that 1 or 2 minute of individual work is up and done, then everybody pulls everything into like a Google Doc, and then we make sure that we look through the Google Doc, see if there's any duplicates, and kind of talk through it together. What I realize is that by sharing, having this separate structure of individual work before you then move on to like a kind of group work, you're able to actually have a lot more insights gathered from this kind of brainstorming or researching process. Awesome. Without further ado, let's continue on with the synthesis and analysis stage. So once that you've conducted all your interviews, as well as collected all your forms and gathered all these different bits of information, the next stage that you want to do is to figure out how can you potentially synthesize these insights and potentially categorize them. And so some of the buckets and areas that you might be thinking about are like, what are some of the conflicts in these ideas? What are some of the opportunities? And what are some of the pain points? So earlier I mentioned that through that kind of self-understanding and the root cause analysis of myself, I kind of understand that one of the pain points here is that I feel like I don't have enough time to talk to my grandparents. And yet one of the conflicts is that I know that I wish that I have a closer connection with my grandparents. And I know that I wish that I could have more time to potentially talk to them. And so that tension in itself is a form of conflict. Another pain point that I mentioned earlier is the fact that certain students potentially might face like language barriers, or their grandparents might be suffering from certain cognitive conditions that might hinder their ability to kind of converse properly. And so these are different additional pain points that you can address and kind of put into this kind of different buckets to kind of understand a little bit more around the specific problem space that you want to explore. Once you do that, then you want to kind of Also think about creating a process map or a journey map, as well as a user persona. Now, these are two additional toolkits that you can pull out from your toolbox. And so like with the user persona, you're thinking about who the ideal potential target user would be. So in the case of like Grand Connect, for example, I might think that I'm potentially like a target user. So I'm like a college student around the age of like 18 to like 21. My name in this case might be like John Doe, for example, just to make it a little bit more generic. My goals might be that, hey, I want to have a stronger connection with my grandparents. And the motivation is because I think that, it's important for us to kind of have that connection. But then at the same time, I feel like I'm so busy with my coursework, and I'm having other troubles with connecting with my grandparents, such as like language barriers. And my grandparents is also very old. And so they, unfortunately, potentially might be having some cognitive handicaps that potentially might be holding them back. And so kind of creating that user persona allows us to understand a little bit more about the different frustrations. Another thing that you can look at is doing an process map analysis, right? So thinking about what does this whole process actually looks like. And so, for example, in like Grand Connect, for example, step one might be like, hey, I want to initiate a conversation with my grandparents. I suddenly remembered them while I was flipping through my photo album. Step two might be like I pull up my phone and I try to look for their contact. Step three is then I like stare at that the contact screen and then I like, send them a text message. Step four is that I wait for them to reply before I then kind of engage in that conversation. And once you break it down into these different stages, then you can kind of understand, okay, what is the level of importance and the level of satisfaction between each stages. So I think that stage one, being able to potentially see, recall about my grandparents, potentially either by like flipping them through the phone album or something, that is relatively high, and I'm pretty satisfied with that. Step two, with, for example, thinking about my finding their contact on the phone, that's relatively easy because I just need to type in their name. Step three is then like having to like potentially send them the first text. Well, when I'm staring into that big white blinking screen, that's something that I feel like very stressed about because I don't know what to send them, right? And so that kind of hesitation there is a big hit on the satisfaction. And so even though I know that it's important to make that kind of first move and send them that text, which is very high important, the current satisfaction level is relatively low from my vantage point. And so once you kind of do this kind of process mapping, you can understand at which stage of the process of this problem are you specifically, would people specifically struggle with. And so you always want to try and find stages where there is of relative high importance, but where current satisfaction levels are relatively low. And like I mentioned, categorizing these insights, creating these personas, and coming up with these process maps are all different kind of tools within your tool belt that you can pull out during a hackathon to better understand about the kind of problem space that you're exploring. Because these design thinking processes, in addition to being helpful during your ideation and your problem understanding stage, is also helpful for you later down the line when you're trying to share and pitch and present your idea to the judges in terms of convincing them that what you've built is actually something that is meaningful and impactful. And so there are different, in addition to using pen and paper, different software that you can use. One of them that I like to use is a Mural, which is a digital whiteboard map. And so as you can see here with this example, you kind of categorize the different insights and kind of try and bucket it, as well as create different matrix to understand the problem a little bit more. But ultimately, what you want to kind of end up with in this kind of understanding the problem stage is a need statement or job to be done. And this is the kind of like the convergence point where you're actually picking on a specific kind of problem that you want to then potentially ideate a solution around. And this need statement follows the format of a certain specific type of user needs B because of C. And this you can have multiple need statements for different stakeholders. in the case of Grand Connect, for example, where I'm sharing a little bit more about like building the relationship with grandparents, the user might be like a college student who just got to college, needs a way to connect better with his grandparents, his or her grandparents, because they don't have enough time and they're facing different hurdles and challenges. And they also are the first time away from home, so they don't get to see their grandparents as frequently face-to-face, right? Similarly, you might also create a need statement for the grandparents as well. So you might say that grandparents need a way to better connect with their grandchildren because, they aren't necessarily always up to date with the latest technologies, and it might be difficult for them to understand a little bit more about what their grandchildren are up to. And it's easy for grandparents these days to potentially feel a general sense of loneliness. And so when crafting these kind of need statements, you want to potentially craft like multiple need statements and then figure out in terms of the different stakeholder groups, what is the core need statement? What is the fundamental need here that you want to potentially ideate a solution around? And so from this, then you can then figure out what are some of the brainstorming solutions that you want to look at. One of the ways to approach this is to generate like generative questions, which are like how might we statements. One of the questions that might come up from, for example, from one of the need statements that I shared earlier, specifically with the college students need a way to find a better way to connect with their grandparents because they're constantly busy and they feel like they don't have enough time and they have different barriers. One of the questions might be like, how might we actually help college students or people who want to connect with their grandparents a little bit better, alternative ways of connecting with their grandparents, right? Or how might we make the process easier, quicker, faster? And so by kind of coming up with these generative questions based on a need statement, you can then brainstorm a lot of potential solutions and hopefully kickstart that creative thinking process. And so then you want to kind of quickly brainstorm the solution, or maybe by the time you reach this stage, you've already come up with a number of solutions and you just want to end up narrowing and picking that solution. But ultimately, you want to kind of, when you pick a solution that you actually want to build on and work on as an MVP, you want to understand two things. Number one is that what is the feasibility of actually building that solution? So this goes back to earlier when we talked about edge analysis and understanding the dynamics and the scope of the team. What can everybody actually do, right? If everybody comes from a background of doing data analytics and data analysis, it might be far further stretch for you guys to potentially try and build a solution that is surrounding cryptocurrency or in the Web3 kind of space. Similarly, you want to kind of potentially judge your solution based on the insights and the criteria that you might want to generate from your need statement, right? So when you think about your need statement and what you actually want to help serve the kind of problem or the community or the stakeholder that you're trying to address, is the solution that you kind of brainstormed actually addressing that specific problem? And so I know that I shared a lot just now with that stage in terms of like understanding the problem and then taking that kind of understanding, synthesizing it before then figuring out and brainstorming what is a potential good solution around that and how to actually choose a good solution. I'm just going to quickly pause here to see if there are any questions around this specific stage. So yeah, I see here from Tintin. He says, hello, can you tell me a little bit more about the EDUCE framework? What is the framework used for? What are the main fields it apply on? What are its pros and cons? And what are the practice of do's and don'ts? So yeah, the EDUCE framework is something that I came up with based on my personal experiences of attending hackathons. I've taken a lot of inspiration from previous design thinking processes, whether that be the D-School design thinking process, or like a lot of advice from entrepreneurship as well as startup information. And I kind of use all of that combined with my personal experiences of attending hackathons to kind of create a EDUCE framework, which is essentially a formula by which I use to identify a meaningful problem to work on, right? And so very earlier on, the first question that we talked about was, why do people come to hackathons? And different people might go to hackathons for different reasons. One of the reasons might be because that they just want to have fun, or perhaps they want to be able to find an impactful solution that they want to work on, or perhaps they want to create a game, for example. The EDUCE framework is specifically designed to kind of help students and learners to find an impactful solution that they want to work on specifically. Yeah, sure. At the end of this presentation, all the information shared here would be made available to everyone. If we can have that previous question, I think that there were two other parts that you wanted to ask. So I see that there's another question here about what are the main fields that it's applied on. I answered that. That's mainly with like hackathon frameworks, but also what I found was that a lot of people have been taking a lot of the advice and insights here and applying it to their project-based classes that they're doing as well. What are its pros and cons? I think, like I mentioned earlier, the pros is that it's really able to kind of help support you in terms of finding an impactful solution that you want to work on that is personally meaningful. One of the potential cons is that if you just take this framework blindly, it might be difficult for you to actually navigate through the entire hackathon, because what I realized when putting this into practice is that we often kind of take alternative paths or end up using certain components. So I would approach this framework more, instead of a linear process, more like a list of toolkits under your tool belt. And you're pulling up the right tools when you're using it. Yeah, cool. Thank you for your amazing questions. I'm going to continue to move on here. And so once you've, first of all, understand in terms of from an edge analysis perspective, what are the scope and the capabilities of the team, then you kind of walk through discovering a problem that you kind of personally identify with, that is personally meaningful to you. And then you go through the process of understanding a little bit more of that problem via the cone of understanding, as well as understanding potentially what a potential solution might be like based on the need statement that you've generated. The next stage is then to potentially create a solution as well as a story that would support that solution as well. And so some of the guiding questions that you want to think about when you're creating the solution or this story is that, what is the wow factor in your solution here? Like how would it really impress the judge? What are the most critical features that you actually want to implement? How can you quickly and rapidly prototype this as quickly as possible? Can you build a rapid prototype in like 60 minutes, for example? And how can you frame your story to make sure that not only is it impactful, but also positive? And the trick here and the secret sauce here is to see, how can I potentially get judges' feedback or other people's feedback on the idea or a prototype as rapidly as possible? And so here are some of the specific activities that would kind of help to support those guided questions. The first one is to potentially do a little bit more of competitive analysis via research a little bit further. So earlier I mentioned that when you're doing the secondary research phase, you're looking at potentially what are the research papers out here there. In this kind of quick Googling phase, you might want to think about what are some of the existing solutions and platforms that currently exist out there. Check out, are there any critical features that they implemented that you're potentially missing? Are there any trends that you're missing? Or what is specifically your competitive advantage, right? And so with us, for example, when we're thinking about connecting grandparents with grandchildren, when we were looking at the way that other platforms, video conferencing platforms, were able to connect the grandparents with the grandchildren, one of the things that they made clear was that it was very intuitive from the grandparents' perspective, and that they didn't necessarily need to be too aware of the technology, because after all, they might not be as adapted to the latest technology. And so one of the insights that we gained from kind of doing that quick analysis was that we needed to make sure, at least from the grandparents' perspective, that they're comfortable using whatever technology or however the solution was designed, that it has to be intuitive for the grandparents' perspective. And then we were also thinking about what was our competitive advantage. So for us specifically, having done the kind of understanding process, the solution that we kind of decided to try and build an MVP around was to build an AI app that leverages generative AI to kind of figure out how can we create conversation openers for college students or people who want to connect with their grandparents, a better way to potentially think about what kind of topics or questions that they might want to ask. And so in terms of our wow factor, since we kind of created the solution just as ChatGPT was coming out, our wow factor was being able to kind of incorporate generative AI into our solution here and think a little bit more about, having that kind of AI supporting a lot of these kind of conversation openers. And that also served as our competitive advantage as well. And so then the next thing that you want to do once you've kind of done that competitive research and competitive analysis is that you want to potentially create a paper frame. And so a wireframe could be, something that you just draw literally on paper, as you can see right here. These are in fact specific paper mockups that I created in past hackathons, where I just rapidly draw out what I think that the sketch of my solution would look like. And once you kind of created that paper frame, another thing that you want to make sure that you look at is also what are the next steps and the roadmaps in terms of building out your solution, and what is this tech stack that you use. Note here that when I go to a hackathon, I don't jump necessarily into specifically a tech stack that I want to use, because my aim of going to a hackathon is finding a meaningful and purposeful project to work on. Now, the caveat here is that different people go into different hackathons for different reasons, right? If you're going to attend a hackathon specifically to try out, Web3 technologies or to try out the specific API, go for it. Try and implement something specific there. But if you're really trying to find and identify a problem space that really speaks out to you and potentially speaks out to other people and speaks out to the judges, you don't want to necessarily be thinking about your tech stack too early on before you've figured out what exactly the problem that you want to solve. And so with this planning stage, it's equally important, because what I found is that with the kind of framework and the activities that I try to walk through with my team and I do with the groups that I engage with, we often end up, spending around 4 or 5 hours into the hackathon, often like spending half a day just figuring out what the problem space that we want to do and how we want to potentially structure and orientate our solution. And so really being able to budget the remaining time to figuring out how can we actually build a proof of concept is so critical, because if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. And you really need to be strict on yourself in terms of figuring out hard deadlines and figuring out how am I actually going to pull all of this together. Because if you have all you have is a great idea and a great story, if you don't have like at least something to show or at least prove that like what you're building is like novel or even possible, it is very hard to convince the judges that what you've hacked together is awesome. And so really, in terms of prototyping your solution here, you really want to think about it in terms of like put it into three steps. So once you kind of understand that problem and come up with a solution, you want to make sure that you are clear with what are the core criteria that you want to kind of prove and validate for your audience. So in terms of criteria, usually they're split into two buckets. Some are must-have, some are nice to have. So with going back to the example that I shared earlier about Grand Connect, which is an app that connects your grandparents with your with you or with your grandchildren, for example. The criteria here, a must-have criteria, is that this interface has got to be intuitive from the grandparents' perspective, right? A must-have here is that it must be able to help college students to save time, because that is one of the key critical pain points that they have. A nice to have is potentially a polished website that would present the idea. Or a nice to have might be the fact that when we're using generative AI agents, that the AI would like, I don't know, say hi to the student as well, or say hi to the person using the app as well as the grandparent. You want to really make sure, as you're thinking about different features that you want to build out, which are the ones that you actually want to prioritize and what are really core to what you're trying to build out here. Because so often I find ourselves like coming out with all these cool ideas. Oh, I can add this feature, add this feature, add this feature. And we end up pursuing features that we think that are easier to add, that we end up procrastinating from the core solution that we're trying to build up. And that is a big no-no. And so using that kind of criteria to help kind of guide us in terms of planning out how we actually want to build out the solution, we then move on to the second stage, which is to build out a mock-up of the app. And so that is using paper wireframes. Before then, we then turn that paper wireframe into MVPs. And so as you can see here on the right-hand column is like kind of like what the web app of past hackathons that I built kind of looks like. And so, for example, with Grant Connect, like I mentioned earlier, some of the key criteria and the must-haves that we realized was that the app should definitely have a way to potentially take a user's phone number so that they can text to the user. The app should have a way to potentially collect some of the grandparents' information for us to generate actual personalized conversation openers. The app should have a way to potentially send information to the user's phone. Some of the nice to have is that the app should potentially be allowed the user to choose through a list of suggested prompts, right? And so previously, you know, although you might think that this is an important feature, what we realized is that, you know, it is much lower down the priority, because really what we want to provide is a suggestion for the user, right? And so we don't necessarily need to create the interactions for the user to actually choose through the list of prompts. Instead, we can suggest them 3 prompts at a time that they can then, you know, decide which one that they actually want to send to their grandparents or use as a conversational opener in a video conferencing call. And so figuring out these kind of criteria and your priorities help you figure out how you're going to potentially structure and prioritize your time. Because when you think about specific features, right, you can then ask yourself, okay, how long is this feature going to take me? Let's say, for example, the app should have a way to take in a user's phone number. I know I need to set up Twilio and somehow get or set up a form on a website, and the website should be able to collect the user's phone number. Okay, so setting up the website would probably take me around like 20 minutes, and then having a form that would collect data would potentially take me around like 40 minutes, right? Because I need to set up the database as well. Okay, so that would take me approximately around an hour. And so having those kind of insights are important, because then you can figure out, going back earlier again to budgeting your time, how do you actually spend your time and allocate your time effectively in a hackathon? And so when you're kind of creating your wireframe, this is kind of an example again of specifically with Grant Connect. Very, very simple. In fact, I think the first iteration of this was drawn on pen and paper, but I've kind of digitized this here for you to make it simpler. But all we needed was a quick homepage that we collected a telephone number of like the person who wants to, you know, have a closer connection with their grandparents. And so then, you know, tell us a little bit about their grandparent. And then once we have those 2 information, then we just kind of make that API call to OpenAI's AI, and then we then send the message out back to the person, right? And so this quick wireframe here kind of shows us, okay, what are the main interfaces that we actually really need to build, and what are the forms that we need. So as you can see right here, potentially need a form that would collect 2 information, telephone number, and information about grandparents. In addition to your wireframe, which is more about like the front end, how that front end design should look like, you also want to know a little bit more about how the data model would look like as well. And so, for example, here, you know, key data that we want to potentially know about the grandparents includes potentially like name, where they're currently based in terms of location. Are they a veteran, right? Because what we realized when we were talking to during our user research phase as well was that if they were a veterinarian, then they would actually have a lot of great stories to share with kind of the grandchildren. And so that's something potentially that we wanted to kind of like flag and look out for. Another thing that we might want to understand is like what kind of languages that they speak, right? Or is there a language barrier? What is their age range? And we didn't want to collect a specific age because we realized that that wasn't really too important. But instead, we wanted to know, are they in their 80s, their 70s, and their 60s? Potentially, do they have like, you know, dementia or other kind of cognitive handicaps? What are some of their hobbies or favorite memories? Some of the things here that I want to make sure, though, is that when you're collecting data about your users, you want to try and collect the minimal amount of data that is necessary for you to kind of validate your idea. Because, you know, data privacy is so important that if you can collect with less information here, that might be actually more helpful, not only for you, but also for the people that you're designing your app and your solution around. And kind of tying it back earlier to here, you know, if you think about this front end, there might be just two, like the simplest data model is just a telephone number and information about grandparents, which could be a string. But with this specific data model, we kind of broke that down into kind of sub points that we actually wanted to collect and more information on. But then by kind of collecting that information, we can then figure out which of these data points are actually the most critical one, and are there any things that we can end up crossing out. So I think here we ended up, at the end of the day, we ended up crossing out like hobbies, because although we know that like hobbies are great, but I think that is something that people would automatically share, and we didn't need to specify that in that form. And a quick way to also be able to kind of test out whether your data model is good or valid is to, again, create a quick Google form and kind of share that with your friends or share that with potential test users, and be like, hey, you're trying to build an app that would share information or help you figure out conversation starters with your grandparents. Can you like fill out this Google form really quick and for our project, right? And so once they fill out that Google form, then you can kind of take that data from the CSV and figure out, can I parse this data into something meaningful? And so that's a quick way to kind of iterate and rapidly test whether or not the data model or the form data that you're collecting is valid in the first place, before having to define all your schemas and set it up the whole database, because actually you're able to iterate and prototype much more rapidly then. And so in addition to kind of creating a solution and rapidly prototyping, you also want to create a story around your idea. But before we move on to that part, I want to quickly pause here to see if there are any questions around like, how do you actually build out a rapid prototype? Because I know that that is a big hot topic. A lot of people are really mostly interested in terms of how to actually build this out technically rapidly. Awesome. So if there's no questions, we can move forward towards how do you actually create a pitch deck to kind of share your idea. So now that you've actually understand from a holistic perspective, what are the capabilities of the team, right? You've discovered a problem that is personal to you, that are tied to your personal anecdotes. In my case of Grand Connect, it was the fact that, I feel like I don't have a close enough connection with my grandparents. Then you understand the problem through the kind of cone of understanding by thinking about how this problem relates to you, as well as doing user research in terms of understanding how this problem relates to other people around you, as well as secondary research. Then you kind of worked on creating an MVP. How do you then potentially create and sell your idea and present it to the judge? Well, if you've followed this process correctly, or at least done some of the previous components, this process should come rather intuitively and naturally to you, because all you need to do is invert that initial cone of understanding that we kind of created. And so the way that I like to structure my videos, 1 to 2 minute video submissions, is that I would then kind of invert this cone and first of all share about how this problem relates to me, and how this problem relates to people around me, and why this problem relates to the wider brother and wider society at large. And so here, for example, with specifically with Grand Connect, if you get a chance to check out my dev post, you can see our demo video. I started off with sharing a little bit about my personal story with my grandparent, and then I moved on to share a little bit more about the observations that we made during the kind of user interview, talking a little bit more about the challenges with language barrier, as well as cognitive handicaps, and then talking about the wider societal issues about like intergenerational separation and loneliness, before then hitting them why our solution is created and how our solution specifically addresses this problem, and why everybody should pay for it, and why everybody should care about it. And so that's when you actually hit them with the most effective kind of video in terms of presenting not only kind of your journey here, but also like the incentives and the motivations behind the kind solution that you're building. I find that so often a lot of people, they end up presenting like their app or their project without really understanding what are the root causes behind what they're trying to build. And so when you kind of do all these other components in the first place, this final story component should come rather naturally to you. And so in terms of components of a good presentation, what would a good final pitch look like? These are some of the questions that you want to ask and make sure that you're addressing. What is the specific problem that you're trying to explore? Who is the target user? Who is this thing designed for? What is the need statement, right? You might want to potentially actually share that need statement or some form of that need statement in your video. And then you want to potentially share, okay, now that you shared this need statement, what does your current solution look like? What does the demo potentially look like? Since this is a hackathon, you might also want to spend some time sharing a little bit about your tech stack, how your solution is specifically addresses the problem, how big is the problem, right? Quantifying it a little bit better. If it's a big problem that you want people to pull at people's heartstrings and make people actually care. And what are the next steps for it, right? What are the assumptions that you've made that you now want to potentially validate in the next stages of it? And so once you finally created, now you've created your solution, MVP, or prototype, as well as created your story to kind of support it, and then you're about to present it to the judges. But before that, you might want to, if you have spare time to spare, you might want to also make sure that you try and evaluate your final solution as well, right? And so for me personally, going into hackathons, I want to make sure that I set up a hard cutoff time, the 9 p.m. the day before, to make sure that at least the pitch and the story and the demo video is all hopefully recorded by 9 p.m. the day before, because that allows us to potentially work on some of the stretch goals and the nice to have features during those final couple hours. And it just generally makes life a lot easier and a lot less stressful compared to waiting till the last minute. But another thing, that advantage that this gives me, is that by starting to work on these pitch videos by like 9 p.m. the night before, usually we would get them done by like, that evening. And then the next day, we potentially might have like 1 to 2 hours to go around and just asking people about, hey, what do you think about our current solution? Do you have any potential questions? Because what I found is that you want to make sure that you get feedback frequent and early on, because other people might have actually good ideas and good suggestions that make you want to tweak or adjust your pitch, right? And adjust your story to make sure you're potentially not only expanding on certain points or addressing certain uncertainties or points that people might not necessarily be clear about. And so when you go around sharing with your idea with other people, some of the things that you want to potentially ask them for feedback on, in addition to how cool they think that your app is there a wow factor, right? Do you think that this really stands out? Like kind of observing their reactions there, thinking about how cool do you think that the technology used is it intuitive? And just generally getting their feedback upon, like, does this story actually pull at your heartstring, right? Is there another way that potentially you can phrase the story to make sure that it's coming across as effective, and ideally also understanding of the situation as well. And so without further ado, that's the main kind of deep dive into the EDUCE framework right here. Are there any questions? Thank you. That's one of my favorite quotes as well. I think that definitely making sure that you come in with a plan is so important. That's why going to each hackathon, I often, at the end of the hackathon, I definitely reflect on what is one thing that I want to take away from this hackathon experience, like whether that could be like technology, a connection, or usually it's something like that I think that I messed up or could have done a little bit better. And I kind of write all of those learnings and those principles into a document that I use, that I read right before I go into every hackathon. And so personally, I have a checklist that I make sure that I go through before every hackathon, certain guiding questions to make sure that I'm not falling into the same pitfalls that I've made in previous hackathons. But yeah, going in with a plan is so important. Awesome. So yeah, if you guys can fill out this form, I would really, really appreciate it to kind of learn a little bit more about your thoughts about the EDUCE framework after I kind of develop this myself. Would love to know if you guys have any additional feedback or thoughts here. In addition, if you guys want to check out and learn a little bit more, I've kind of uploaded a little cheat sheet here, which you can scan the QR code to access as well. Are any further questions? I'm more than happy to take any questions that people might have.
Apologize, I'm muted. I can jump in and answer this question. Someone asked where the recording will be available. You can watch this right here on Twitch if you're watching here, or over on our YouTube. So whichever platform you're watching on right now, it'll be here right after we end the session.
Yeah, and please do let me know what are your thoughts. Fill out this form. There's also another form shared initially thinking about why are the reasons that you potentially go to hackathons. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about hackathon experiences, feel free to share your contact there. It's an optional for you guys to share that. And, I'd be more than happy to connect or answer any questions that you guys might have. I'm sharing these frameworks with you guys because I think that, this is definitely my secret sauce. And it's something that I kind of learned over the past, 2-3 years. Personally, I've gotten a chance to work on a startup. And so a lot of these principles are also extrapolated from that and kind of figuring it and fitting that out into a hackathon. And so hopefully you guys have taken away something awesome and something helpful. And I think that sometimes like the results also speak to themselves as well. I've had the great opportunity of winning a number of hackathons. I think my longest streak was going 7 wins in a row. And so definitely, I think that if you guys are interested, I'd be more than happy to chat more and share any more resources.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Chinat. This was amazing. I will make sure I share those links over in Discord as well if anyone didn't get a chance to grab all of them here. But with that, I think we are good to wrap. I guess any final words, Chinat?
Good luck, everyone. I hope to see you guys at the next hackathon. If you guys ever want to look for a hackathon teammate, feel free to try and hit me up on Discord. If you hit me up maybe 2 days in advance, maybe I'll get back to you. But otherwise, thank you all for coming here. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you, MLH, for giving me this awesome opportunity to share this with everybody else.
Of course, this was awesome. Thank you so much. Happy
Thank you.
hacking.